November 1944. A massive, muddy supply depot in northern France. Rain falls straight down into the black grease of truck tracks and frozen puddles. Men scrape ice from windshields while diesel engines sputter against the bitter, heavy fog. A lone mechanic crawls beneath the rusted steel hull of a broken combat vehicle. His bare hands numb, his wrench slipping against stripping bolts. He requests a replacement part from a warm, brightly lit office nearby. The request is denied instantly with a heavy ink stamp. The man behind the desk laughs, tosses the paperwork into a scrap pile, and pours himself another steaming mug of fresh coffee. He says the men outside do not need functional machines, because their entire presence in this war is nothing more than a public relations stunt. General George S. Patton is about to change his mind. This is the story of the 761st Tank Battalion facing systemic leadership negligence when survival meant fighting the enemy and the bureaucracy. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when prejudice met consequences, uncovering the hidden human costs behind the great military victories. Corporal Samuel Davis was 20 years old. He came from the steel mill neighborhoods of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he served as a line mechanic in the 761st Tank Battalion. Before the war, he worked alongside his father, pulling white-hot metal from the furnaces, learning how heat shapes iron. He enlisted the day after his 19th birthday, eager to prove his worth in a brand-new armored division. Instead, he found himself staring at the frozen, jagged metal of stripped gears in the French mud. He had seen 3 of his closest friends burn alive inside a Sherman tank during their first engagement near the border. The transmission had slipped while they tried to reverse away from an anti-tank gun. Now his fingers were permanently blackened by grease, diesel fuel, and dried blood. He spent his nights shivering under a canvas tarp, using a sputtering welding torch to patch together metal tracks with pieces of scrap iron salvaged from a nearby junkyard. Major Arthur Sterling was 38 years old, an ordnance supply officer from a wealthy family in Boston, Massachusetts. He belonged to the communications of zone staff, far behind the firing lines. Sterling believed that the segregated units were a complete waste of modern military machinery, often telling his subordinates that certain men lacked the inherent mechanical aptitude required to operate heavy tanks. He sat comfortably in a wooden office built inside a dry, heated brick warehouse. His boots were shined to a mirror finish, and he wore a clean, custom-tailored wool uniform. On his desk sat a plate of white bread and a clean porcelain cup of black coffee. His primary duty was maintaining the strict priority allocation schedule, a bureaucratic shield he used daily to ensure that every replacement engine, track link, and spark plug went exclusively to white armored units. He signed his name with a heavy fountain pen, systematically denying the requests from the 761st. By late autumn of 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had slowed down significantly. The rapid pursuit that followed the breakout from Normandy had completely exhausted the fuel reserves, and the supply lines now stretched hundreds of miles back to the coast. The weather had turned brutal, bringing freezing rain, thick mud, and early snowstorms that grounded aircraft and stalled mechanized movements. In this climate of operational strain, the massive supply depots held absolute power over life and death on the front lines. A single signature from an administrative officer could determine which battalion received the equipment necessary to survive the coming winter combat, and which unit was left to freeze in the field. The military bureaucracy operated under strict, unwritten codes of favoritism and bias. Many rear echelon commanders and supply staff looked at the segregated combat units with open skepticism, believing that the experiment would fail the moment these men faced sustained enemy fire. Because of this widespread prejudice, higher headquarters frequently overlooked the maintenance requirements of these specific outfits. While frontline units desperately needed spare parts to replace what had been destroyed by German artillery, the logistics network routinely diverted shipments to more favored divisions. Other administrative officers had let this unfair practice slide for months, looking away while paperwork vanished into filing cabinets, and critical components were stockpiled in rear warehouses. The division commanders were often too consumed by the map coordinates and fuel shortages to inspect the lower-level supply ledgers. This systemic neglect created a dangerous situation where combat readiness was compromised by prejudice, leaving undersupplied tankers to face heavy anti-tank fire with faulty machinery. Back at the supply depot in northern France, the heavy wooden doors of the main office creaked open as a shivering battalion motor officer stepped inside out of the freezing rain. The battalion motor officer wiped the freezing rain from his eyes and placed 3 stained requisition forms on the desk. He asked politely for the replacement gaskets and the left side track links that had been promised to his unit last week. Major Sterling did not look up from his paperwork. He reached for his cup of coffee, took a slow sip, and said that the allocation schedule had changed due to emergency operational priorities. The motor officer explained that 2 of his tanks were completely immobilized in the forward assembly area, and a third had stripped its drive sprocket during the morning advance. He noted that the men were currently operating under direct orders to move out before dawn. Major Sterling leaned back in his chair, adjusted the crisp collar of his tailored uniform, and stated that the current supply level did not permit the distribution of heavy hardware to non-essential units. The motor officer pulled out a field copy of the maintenance manifest, showing that a fresh shipment of 60 replacement engines had arrived at the depot by rail just yesterday. He requested that at least one of those engines be released to replace a cracked block in his lead platoon. Sterling laughed softly, tapped his fountain pen against the wooden desk, and answered that those specific engines were reserved exclusively for the main armored divisions. The motor officer stated that his men were scheduled to lead the primary assault against a fortified ridge within 48 hours, and going in with failing transmissions meant certain death for the crews. Sterling stood up, looked down at the mud-stained boots of the frontline officer, and said that he was not going to waste prime American machinery on a unit that wouldn't know how to use it anyway. He added that everyone in the rear knew their combat role was nothing more than a public relations stunt designed to satisfy politicians back in Washington. The motor officer stared at the desk for a long moment, his jaw tight, his fists clenched at his sides. He realized that no amount of regulations, signatures, or official combat orders would change the mind of the man sitting in the warm office. He picked up his rejected paperwork, stepped back out into the freezing downpour, and immediately walked toward the regional command tent to speak directly with the senior staff. The report detailing the deliberate withholding of critical combat equipment reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top Jeep pulled directly into the frozen mud of the supply yard, the vehicle sliding to a halt just yards from the warehouse doors. 4 polished silver stars caught the dim winter light on the front of his helmet, and the unmistakable grips of his ivory-handled revolvers rested against his hips. The general stepped down into the slush without breaking his stride, his wool overcoat snapping in the bitter wind. Every soldier in the vicinity froze, snapping to immediate attention as the commanding general walked into the main office unannounced. The warm air inside smelled of roasted coffee beans and fresh ink. Patton studied the immaculate room, his eyes moving over the roaring pot-belly stove before settling directly on the administrative officer. Patton asked who was responsible for the vehicle allocation logs. Sterling stood up quickly, saluting with rigid precision, and stated that he maintained the master ledgers for the entire regional sector. Patton asked why 3 combat-ready Sherman tanks were currently sitting idle behind the main warehouse, while frontline units were using scrap metal to patch their treads. Sterling cleared his throat, smoothed the front of his tailored uniform, and answered that those specific machines were reserved for the primary armored drive, according to the theater priority charts. Patton asked if a machine was considered useful when it sat empty in the rear while men died for lack of firepower. Sterling hesitated, his face turning slightly pale, and replied that standard administrative procedures required keeping a strategic reserve for maximum operational efficiency. Patton looked at him for a long moment, his voice quiet, but it carried across the room. He said that an army does not win battles by hoarding steel in the rear while men bleed in the trenches. He noted that the charts on the wall did not kill enemy anti-tank crews, nor did they hold the frozen ridges against a counterattack. He stated that a soldier who deliberately starves his own comrades of weapons is doing the work of the enemy without ever pulling a trigger. He pointed out that while Corporal Davis was freezing in the mud, trying to weld broken tracks with junk, thousands of new parts were being hidden behind bureaucratic excuses. Patton gave Sterling a binary choice. The major could either face an immediate court-martial for the deliberate sabotage of combat effectiveness, or he could personally drive the first brand-new Sherman tank out of the warehouse, deliver it directly to the 761st, and spend the entire night in the freezing mud, helping the mechanics swap the engines. Sterling looked at the general, swallowed hard, and picked up his field cap. The heavy iron doors of the warehouse rolled back with a loud screech, and the first brand-new Sherman tank rolled out into the freezing downpour. Major Sterling sat in the driver's seat, his hands shaking against the cold metal levers as he steered the massive vehicle through the deep black sludge toward the assembly area. The freezing rain soaked through his tailored wool uniform within minutes, turning his expensive boots into heavy blocks of ice. When the tank reached the staging line, Corporal Davis was waiting under a sputtering lantern, his face smeared with black grease, and his wrench ready. Patton stood a few yards away in the darkness, his arms crossed over his chest, watching silently as the cold water pooled on the brim of his helmet. Under the watchful eye of the general, the arrogant supply officer climbed down into the thick mud and took a heavy iron wrench from the corporal. For the next 8 hours, Sterling worked on his knees in the freezing slush, his fingers bleeding as he scraped ice from frozen bolts and helped lift a massive replacement engine into the chassis. Dozens of frontline tankers stood nearby in the rain, watching the major strip away his pride with every turn of the wrench. Corporal Samuel Davis returned home to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, after the war ended. He went back to the steel mills, working alongside his father for another 35 years, before retiring to a quiet life with his family. He rarely spoke about the freezing mud of northern France, or the night he spent working under a lantern with an arrogant major, but he kept a small, rusted iron track bolt on his dresser until the day he died in 1988. The heavy metal object reminded him of the night the Army finally listened to the mechanics. Major Arthur Sterling was reassigned to a remote administrative post in southern Italy just 3 weeks after the incident, his clean uniform and reputation permanently stained by the night in the mud. He left the service in 1946 and returned to Boston, where he lived out his days in bitter obscurity, working as a corporate accountant until his death in 1974. He never wore his military decorations and refused to attend any wartime reunions. General Patton kept the official maintenance reports locked inside his personal field desk for the remainder of the European campaign, never mentioning the confrontation to his staff or referencing it in his public memoirs. In a private letter to his wife written just 3 days after the inspection, the general noted that an army is only as strong as its lowest private, and any officer who forgets the value of a man in the mud is a liability to the United States. Some historians have argued that Patton's intervention at the supply depot was an unnecessary display of grandstanding that bypassed the established military chain of command and disrupted standard logistical schedules during a critical phase of the autumn offensive. They claim that humiliating an administrative officer publicly did little to solve the larger, systemic transportation shortages plaguing the entire European theater. Others argue the opposite, maintaining that the general's aggressive and unorthodox actions were entirely justified because they immediately exposed deep-seated prejudice and forced the rear echelon bureaucracy to prioritize the physical survival of frontline combat crews. What is certain is that the 761st Tank Battalion received their replacement parts the next morning and successfully led the armored push against the fortified enemy ridge. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have chosen a softer alternative and handled the matter quietly through standard military channels? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about what happened when prejudice met consequences, make sure to subscribe.